Line's good.
Never on.
Whoa.
Hard. Hardly.
Come on, Brent.
Line's good.
Got real close.
I hear high, right?
Try and hit 2/3.
Have they saved it for her? Yes, they have.
Ooh, welcome to Game of Stones, everybody. I am Sean Graham, Scott alongside, as always. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Sean. Happy end of football season.
Yeah, big game on Sunday. We watched it together. It was a lovely afternoon. Made wings and nachos.
Yeah. Wings, nachos, some salad.
Yeah, it was a lovely experience. And we actually double screened during the game watching Canada play somebody. Eve Muirhead?
Yes. No,
that's right.
No, that was
No.
in the morning after China.
No, the Russians.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. So we had that game going on along with the curling that we were double screening the whole time. It was or not the whole time, but once the curling started. So it's been a very busy week with all the action going on from over in Beijing. And Scott, it's I don't know, like, how would you describe it so far? What's your main takeaway from the curling so far at the Olympic Games? The 4-person curling.
So yeah, 4-person curling. It's been pretty predictable, notwithstanding a couple of quite surprising results, namely China on the women's side beating Sweden. But Ryan from Rocks Across the Pond did predict that, so I guess we can't say it was that unpredictable. But it's been like pretty chalky, right?
Yeah, I think so. You know, in our preview, we talked about how on the women's side, they were just kind of beat up on each other, and that you had Switzerland, Sweden as the two best teams there. And that has kind of emerged in the standings, even though, as you say, China did upset Team Sweden, but they're there and pretty much ensconced in playoff positions at this point. Not guaranteed, but it'd be surprising for the two of them to drop down. And on the men's side, there's a clear top three, and those are the top three teams in the standings right now. There is an opportunity for Canada to fall out, but it is very unlikely, as we were speaking, for Canada to fall out. They have Wednesday off as well, so they can sit in this position for a while until their final game against Bruce Mount. But those top three, other results pending, of course, but it seems like everyone else, as we said in the preview, is playing for fourth place. So interesting results along the way, sure. But overall, nothing has stood out as much as South Korea in 2018 having that great week. Like, we're not seeing anyone really have that type of a breakout event.
No, exactly. It's pretty much as expected. You might think the Japanese women are a little better than was thought, but we talked about them before. They're a great team. And so, yeah, pretty much as expected so far.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the biggest stories coming out of Beijing so far. I have a few here that I'd like to discuss here, Scott. So let's start with the two top teams and just some interesting stats that I think have contributed to them being at the top of the table on the men's and women's side. Let's start with the women and the Swiss team. Of course, Silvana Tirinzoni with 4 stones being thrown by Alina Pats. They are really doing a very good job defensively, Scott. They've only given up 38 points so far in their 7 games. The British actually have given up fewer points in their games, but a 74% force efficiency rate for Silvana Tirinzoni and the team. So they're just not giving teams an opportunity to score against them. Their peripheral on the hammer side isn't as great as some of the other teams in the field, but if you don't let the other team score, you're not going to lose games. So that's one stat that I was kind of taken by just going through the numbers today, as to, if you're looking for explanations as to why they're doing so well, they're really doing a good job controlling the game when the other team has the hammer.
Yeah, and if, like you say, if you're not letting the other team score, you're going to win a lot of those games. I did watch a couple of their games. Their first game early against Eve Muirhead, I think it was the opening draw. Alina Pats struggled. She was really not sharp, and Eve had a bad draw in the 11th and sort of handed them the game. I think that's something that we might look back at the end of the week and say that's a real turning point, because if Switzerland gets off to that 0-1 start, maybe they're digging a little deeper, trying a little bit harder, pressing that much more, and we don't see them get the momentum and those big wins that followed coming out of that. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair assessment that you want to get off on that right foot. They're so good. I don't know if losing one game would have that much of an impact, but yeah, it's always better to win that first game than to lose it. So, you don't press it all, and it puts you in a good spot. So, their only loss at this point is to Sweden and Anna Hasselberg, whose two losses have been to China, as we mentioned, and to the aforementioned Eve Muirhead. So, that's the situation at the top of the table on the women's side. On the men's side, Nick Edin and his team are, of course, at the top of the table, sitting at 7-1 as we record this, with only one game left for them to play. About half and half, I think. Five teams still have two to play. Five still have only one to play. But Nick Edin is in control. He has 39% last stone efficiency. That's not great, actually. That's fourth in the field at 39% for the hammer efficiency. But throw in 10 blanks on top of that for a plus 22. So he's controlling the game when he has the hammer. That the percentage isn't great, but he has more blanks with the hammer than anybody else in the field. So he's being judicious as to when he goes for it, and therefore reducing the opportunities that the other teams have with the hammer. So he's just holding the hammer longer than the other teams. So if you're looking at part of the reason why they've been successful, I think that's one of those numbers that kind of stood out to me as I was going through. But Scott, does anything stand out for you so far on the week for Nick Edin?
Well, also limiting the blanks against, in addition to the force efficiency being up there, that's topped in the field at 67% and only 2 blanks against. So, he's forcing well and also not letting the teams get their blanks. So it's, I guess the force is going to be higher with fewer blanks, but not giving up the big ends or the blanks. So a pretty good job there by Team Edin.
Yeah, and that's just more evidence that they're controlling the house, certainly controlling the front of the house and the guard zone. So they're doing a very good job of just maintaining control of the pace of the game throughout.
Yeah, and they've also started with the last stone in the first end 7 times out of their 8 games. So which is tied for tops in the field with the host Chinese team, actually. So when you start out with the first end, you're forcing other teams, you're gonna do pretty well.
Yeah, you are. Very well said. And Scott, that leads us into the next big story. This is very much a Canadian-based story, or non-story, if you will. The last stone draw for the Canadians has been a bit of an issue so far this week. Jennifer Jones is last of the 10 teams in the last stone draw rankings. Her average distance, 46.78 centimeters. For Brad Gushue, he is 6th in the field. Fortunately for him, he's ahead of the teams he needs to be ahead of, but he's still 6th at this moment at 24.35 centimeters on average in those last stone draws. So, Scott, I looked back to last season and the trials just to see how off these numbers are. Is this a one-off for these teams where Jennifer Jones has been bad for 7 games and Gushue's been not great for 8 games, or is it part of a larger trend for these teams potentially? So at the Briar last year, Gushue had 9 of 12 hammers to start. So he won obviously 9 of the 12 draws to the button before the game. Jennifer Jones had the hammer 7 of 13 times at the Scotties. And then at the trials, Jennifer Jones was actually first in the field at last stone draw at 28.2 centimeters away. And Brad Gushue was third at 22.15. So kind of interesting that Brad Gushue is only 2 centimeters worse this week than he was at the trials, but is down in 6th place. Jennifer Jones and the team obviously has struggled, being 18 centimeters off on average on these last stone draws. So bit of an anomaly for Jennifer Jones. Based on these numbers, she's normally pretty good at it relative to the field, but just an off week there for whatever reason.
With the World Curling Federation, also they have 2 curlers from each team that do the clockwise and then a counterclockwise shot. So there's 2 shots for each game done by different players, which might be different than the way Curling Canada does it for the Briar and Scotties, because I know they don't have, time before the game to run 2 of these shots.
Right.
At the curling trials, I don't remember if they made it in line with the World Curling Federation, but it's really strange to me, Sean. I think that a lot of the practice time is spent by the other teams, certainly, and most of the time by Canada, trying to get the path right for that draw to the button. But with a team like Gushue or Jones that are more experienced, they might not view that as that important as it would be to map out some other spots on the ice. Let's, we're going to have to throw other shots than that draw to the button. So let's make sure we get some of those in practice as well as the draw shot to the button, because that'll set us up better later on in the game. And let's just worry about winning the games rather than having last rock in the first end.
Yeah, especially a team like Jennifer Jones, who, if they don't have the hammer, they're just going to run stuff up. They're going to try to make you score. They're going to make you have difficult shots. So if they have the ice mapped better in the first end, they have a better chance of stealing than an average team would in a course of a game. So yeah, maybe they don't put as much emphasis on it. You need to. It's a tiebreaker here. There are no tiebreaker games, so it's an important thing to have, even if you don't necessarily care individually game to game, if you're somewhat indifferent of having the hammer in the first end. But if that's the reason that you missed the playoffs, it's unfortunate, and I don't really like it. I would rather have tiebreaker games. I understand why they don't, but it's part of the rules. Everybody knew going into it, and they're just having an off week on it too. They're not systemically bad at it, these two teams. They're just struggling more than we've seen them in the past at this.
Yeah, it's the World Curling Federation way of doing it. And if you're playing at the Slam or at the Nationals in Canada, the ties are broken by games. And so it's not really something that you have to worry too much about other than at one of these events. And so, I'm sure if you asked Brad Gushue, what would you rather do? Have time to map out different spots on the ice or get the hammer in the first end? I think he would say, well, yeah, we'd like to know more about the ice that we're going to play on.
They're good enough to do both.
They are. Yes. And you might end up with some situations like today where the ice fools you a little bit and you drop a winnable game.
All right, Scott, next big story from the Olympic Games. This is not just a Canadian issue, but obviously we are watching it from Canada. I think this is a larger problem, and that is the presentation of these games. And I want to preface this by saying this isn't meant to be a criticism of any one individual, but the presentation of these games has been poor, I would argue. In Canada, the level of the sound is not good, and I felt very, not, I don't want to say validated, but it made me feel better that Stokely, who does the sound for the Grand Slams, commented on this today, that he agrees that this is not good, that the players' mics are too low compared to the broadcasters. That is a CBC problem, from what I've gathered from Stokely. That's not the international feed problem, that it's the mixing on the Canadian side. So that's a problem. Visually, the games don't look particularly good. There are little mistakes that are being made in the presentation of these games, little camera things that they are missing. For instance, when you're measuring a stone, don't have the overhead go until the official gets right to the stone and then cut to the player. No, we want to see the measurements. These are little mistakes that are being made in the presentation. And then don't get me started on if I was in the United States and you're cutting to commercial during second stones, what are you doing? You can't, no, don't do that. You got Kevin Martin on the call. Kevin Martin should metaphorically throw himself in front of the train that is the commercial and just say, no, you cannot do this. So these are our issues. And I will just say, I don't think WCF produced events in general, when we see them, because they produce the World Championship one a year, depending on which one's not in Canada. It's usually their cruise. I don't think they look as good as the way Curling Canada sets it up. Just in general, I think the Canadian domestic presentation is better. But this is your signature event. New people are coming to this. Like every 4 years, there's this influx of people who come to the sport who experience it for the first time. And it's great that the feedback is always positive and people are excited about it. But I don't think the visual presentation, and in Canada, the sound presentation, is going to encourage people to come back. You're presenting on television an inferior product than you normally do at your signature event. And for as much as we talk about growing the game and we want new people in, new countries represented, that's all great. But this, and this isn't the first time this has happened, I think it's a problem for the sport. And I really want someone at the WCF to address it moving forward so that these world feeds in 2026 from Italy are more representative of a typical curling broadcast.
Yes, I agree with everything you said, Sean. It's not been top quality. To address maybe why, there was some articles written before the game started that the camera crew, the camera operators, and the production crew on site were all novices at curling, except for the one, its director or producer, I can't remember who, that has some experience with it before. So you're going to have growing pains when you have an inexperienced crew with curling. Should you have an inexperienced crew at what you say is your marquee event? Probably not. But in the case of an event in China during a pandemic, I don't think there was any other feasible way to do it. That said, like, it's better than nothing, what we saw at the Women's Worlds last year in the bubble, right? When the crew couldn't be there. So you'd rather this than nothing. But in an ideal world, I think you're right that they would take the camera operating crew that works for TSN and for Sportsnet and have them on site to be getting the shots, because they get the shots that are that make the presentation so good. There's also great directing in the back, switching to different angles at different times, innovative camera shots from sort of the, I forget what it's called, like the rising boom kind of boom camera, to, you know, the end on shots, the above shots. I think the reason that this hasn't looked as good is because you can't have all those cameras because you're trying to get coverage of 4 sheets at once. So that's another limitation, right?
A little bit it is, but you could have it so that all the sheets are filming from one side of the sheet, the same side. And yeah, you might get a camera person who's filming another sheet in your shot, which I know camera people always hate when camera people are in their shots, but that's just going to happen sometimes. And I would rather have the better angles than randomly see a camera person in a shot. And I think what would be good if they could do this looking ahead to 2026 is, and I know there are logistical issues, and certainly for world championships and stuff, like it's so hard to get people overseas, especially the folks who work with TSN, because they would have just been coming off or getting ready for another world championship, to have them then go do another one in a different country. But for the Olympics, could you take like Sportsnet crew, a TSN crew, who I know, and from Stokely, we know they're not employees of those companies, and some people will work across the slams and then also work with TSN as well. But could you take those folks who do those events and then have them go and kind of be like with what they do with ice crews at these big events, where you have your head ice maker and they bring in more novice ice makers, people who want to get into it? Could it be that sort of a situation where we have better expertise at the top? You have those people, at least somebody who with a lot of experience on each sheet of the ice, working that particular broadcast and bringing people along. Because one of the concerns that you might have is, well, okay, the next time, or what happens when you're trying to present the game in other countries now? Like, could you have some Italian people who are here as part of this event to help them learn and get better for 2026? And same thing for really every other country that's going to eventually start producing their own stuff, just have people there to get used to the rhythm of curling, which is very different from all the other sports. And I would actually be very curious to know too, if fans of other sports find this at the Olympics, right? I'm not deep enough in really any other Olympic sport to know if there is a marked difference in the presentation of the sport at the Olympic when the IOC have control of that world feed compared to the World Cup events when it's just that sport. But I would be curious to know if that's the case, where we see a marked decrease in the quality of the production at the Olympics compared to the typical broadcast.
I think that it is a worse quality for, say, basketball in the Summer Olympics, right? It's definitely not as good as watching an NBA game, and maybe it's just the distance that the cameras are, or the lack of the same sort of passionate crowd. Maybe, I'm not sure, but if curling or the World Curling Federation wants to address this, and I don't see any reason right now why they do, because it's going to cost them money. They have to be willing to invest the money into getting these camera people trained, and I don't know if they see an ROI on that makes it worth their money.
Yeah, I guess it's only once every 4 years where you have 4-sheet coverage at an event, but I don't know. Just a little frustrating to watch at times. That's all.
And yeah, like commercials in the middle of an end is ridiculous. Like, imagine watching a baseball game and somebody gets a single and then they cut away for 30 seconds and you come back and the bases are loaded and 2 runs have scored and you're like, what the heck happened? Right? That's insane.
Right.
So
it's like a sitcom thing where it's like, and the 3-2 pitch cut, and then you have never seen a play like that ever before. You're like, what? Huh? Yeah.
What happened?
So, yeah. So that just sort of a little rant, I guess, on that. Finally, Scott, let's talk a little bit about the ice conditions over there in Beijing. It is, of course, a pool. The rink is built on a pool. They had some issues early in the mixed doubles event in terms of humidity. For the first time ever, they needed more humidity in a building where curling ice was. So they actually filled in one of the hot tubs that the divers use after you dive. One, I don't know why divers go into the hot tub for like 20 seconds after they dive. Someone could explain that to me too. But they filled it up to get more humidity. Brad Gushue, the sheet he was on against ROC, he didn't like it. He said it was dirty. He thought it was very different from the other sheets. One of the reasons might have been the few numbers of spectators who are there are on that side of the sheet, or on that side of the building, excuse me. So that could be leading to some different runs there on the end sheet near the crowd. But overall, like, the ice to me hasn't seemed that bad. Obviously, I'm not there. I'm watching it on the overhead, but it seems like they're getting not as much curl as you would get at a typical Scotties or a Briar, but you're getting enough. There are some straight patches, but what's good about it to me, I think, from what I've been seeing, is that it is very much release dependent, and I like that. That if you're going to float it out, you're probably not going to get it back. You get it started, you might not be able to hold it, right? I think this type of ice really does put a little more onus on the player, the thrower, and the sweepers can't do quite as much. So I'm kind of a fan of that. But independent, Scott, of what Brad Gushue said this morning after his game, what has your observations been of the ice from half a world away?
Well, it seems to me like it's a little bit slower than we would have seen at the Canadian trials or even the Scotties that we just had. Not a lot, but a little bit. And I think the inconsistency, the patchiness, is what's really bothering the players more than anything else, right? It's you want it, release dependent, sure, we can deal with that as long as it's the same everywhere, because you get a big shot on a path that you haven't really played, and you're just really unsure what to do with it, which players who are at this level of curling shouldn't be feeling those kinds of insecurities when it comes to, oh boy, we haven't played over here in a couple ends. It might have changed a lot. That's just something like you don't want to see, right? You want the players to be confident in what they can do and not have it be dependent on the playing surface, which changes over time and changes from game to game.
Very true. And but conditions there have changed a lot on the ground in Beijing. They had snow, crazy. They have that much snow in Beijing. They had their typical annual amount of snow in about 6 hours or something earlier this week. So changing conditions outside. And again, it's a pool. They're playing on top of a pool. So not the easiest conditions for the ice makers. But overall, I think they've seemed to have done a good job. The other part that this isn't really an ice maker thing, although the ice makers tend to work on it. The stones, the electronic handles of the stones continued to malfunction over the course of the week. They've just turned them off. So no issues there. The only thing though, Scott, like if we're going to get rid of the electronic handles, which I think all the players would say like good riddance to them, the sooner the better. The one thing I like about the electronic handles is just the visual of it. I like the silver handle. I like the way that looks on TV, and the yellow and the red is just right on top of the stone. I'm not sure I enjoy the TV, the way it looks on TV when the handle is also the same color, but that's just a minor thing. And I'm probably the only person in the world who even cares about it.
Well, why don't you write to the WCF and say you'd like the colors to be silver handles with red and yellow bodies. That'll
Exactly.
work.
Yeah, I will ask to speak to the manager of the Stones, please. That's what I would like to do. So
very good.
So there you have it. Some of the biggest stories coming out of Beijing. Anything else, Scott?
No, I don't think so. It's been fun to watch. The time zone has worked for the most part for us on the East Coast. The West Coast, it would probably be tough to get that morning draw here, evening draw in China. But I've enjoyed it. I've been waking up a little bit earlier than I usually do to watch in the morning. And I'm lucky to be, working from home in my home office here. And I've got a TV and I've got my iPad, and so I can have a couple of different games going all at once. And as the emails flood in, and I'm multitasking like crazy. But overall, it's been fun to watch.
Yeah, and as I said when the mixed doubles one, I'd rather have that extra hour in the morning, and so it'd be 12 hours instead of the 13 hours. I'd rather have that, but it is what it is. I'd rather start at 9 p.m. rather than 8 p.m. and then the extra hour in the morning if possible, but that's not the case. And if you're out west, you have more of a chance at the afternoon draw than we do here on the East Coast, or on Eastern time, I should say, not the East Coast, with the 10 p.m. start for the afternoon draw in Beijing. And but also God bless the Gushue. Some great photos of Brad Gushue's dad and uncle cracking a beer at 2:30 in the morning, getting ready for one of those afternoon draws over in Beijing. So you make do with what you can. Actually, we played on our Monday league, or was it the Thursday? I can't remember. We played Mark Homan. No, it was a Thursday game. We actually played against Mark Homan and Brent Homan during one of the mixed doubles games. They were not paying attention to the game that we were playing because they had the iPad going with the Morris Homan game going. They still beat the hell out of us.
They're pretty good. And I got a big night planned, Sean, for the Gushue versus Mowat Wednesday evening here in the East, and I'm gonna order a big pizza, crack open a nice brew, and have myself a night watching that. That'll be a good game.
There you go. Very nice. Well, enjoy yourself, Scott, and everybody else. Enjoy what is left of the Olympic curling. We'll be back at some point late weekend, early next week, to talk about all the goings-ons and who ended up with medals from the 2022 Beijing Olympics, which have 5 days left as we sit here as we record on Tuesday afternoon. And do follow along for those episodes. If you have not yet, subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your shows. Do the likes, ratings, comments, all that good stuff. Helps other people find us, keeps us growing. You can also visit us over at GameOfStonesPod.com. All the past episodes are there under the episode tab. You can also click on merch for all the merch that we have. Proceeds going to the Sandra Schmerler Foundation and Food Banks Canada. And we are matching all of those proceeds. And do follow along with all the fun stuff that we got going on social media at Game of Stones Pod on Instagram and Twitter. Game of Stones Podcast on Facebook, and you can let us know what you want to hear on the show. Game of Stones podcast at gmail.com. So that'll be it for this episode. Scott, we're almost through it.
It's been a long 4 years, Sean, and we can see the light at the end of that proverbial tunnel. I'm not sure though if I'm ready for it to end, and then we start a whole new quad and more speculation and stuff. So I'm hoping for good curling the rest of these next 5 days, and yeah, we'll see who ends up at the top of the podium.
Indeed, we will, as we're here at the end of the week, and this is why we lift all those weights, is right here at the home stretch. So enjoy the games, everybody. We'll talk to you very soon, but until then, keep those brooms on the ice and don't dump that intern.
Make the final.